You're listening to the Baha'i World News Service.
Pinilingkod kay Bahá'í.
Across Canada, a growing number of young people are learning that service to their communities is not just an activity, but a way of understanding their purpose in life. In this episode, we hear from Golban Singh, Betty Dai, and Netta Faramandpour, auxiliary board members in Canada. We also hear from Borna Nuruddin and Ayafor, members of the Continental Board of Counselors in North America. They discuss how young people across the country participating in Baha'i moral and spiritual educational programs are arising as protagonists in their communities. From organizing math and science camps that change youth's perception of their own capabilities, to organizing neighborhood forums for youth to reflect on fostering a peaceful society, to consulting with urban planners about how neighborhoods can reinforce harmonious patterns of interaction. From the Baha'i World News Service, this is In Conversation, a podcast series that explores the practical application of Baha'i principles to foster vibrant communities and contribute to social progress, from the grassroots to the international level.
We were talking earlier about the forces that are facing young people and the way we're seeing all these beautiful stories of how young people, youth, are rising and actually finding their place in their neighborhoods and villages. So, maybe we can talk about some of these examples.
When I'm a young person and I'm contributing to my community, I care about education in all of its forms. So when I'm working with the junior youth in my neighborhood, I'm concerned about their moral education. I'm concerned about their spiritual education. But I'm also concerned about their intellectual and their material education. And I think what we are seeing in so many neighborhoods across Toronto is this concern that young people have for the younger generation and how that's manifesting itself in, junior youth may say, I'm struggling with math. I don't like math. I'm struggling with language. And then those older youth are now also thinking, okay, now how can we assist them? How can we help them? And then what we're seeing is like this love for learning that's also now developing, because that same environment that junior youth is in their junior youth group, where there is a thirst for understanding, there is this loving friend or this mentor that is trying to accompany you, that translates also into the way that we're doing math together. And now something that I didn't find so enjoyable, I am enjoying learning about this area.
I think we're just finding that youth have such tremendous capacity to contribute to change and even challenging social issues. In one instance, youth were looking at the school and trying to think about their experience. And as Netta was saying, with math and science, many of them had struggled. And particularly, some of them were women, and they were thinking about the opportunities of women in fields such as science and math, and didn't see that young girls felt that they could contribute to this. So they started a conversation and started looking actually at the academic achievement. And one of the questions that most actually bothered them was that many junior youth were responding that they didn't feel that they were good at math. They didn't feel that they liked math. So they thought of a simple way that maybe they could do something to change their view of math and science, because such a critical part of their education. So they started a series of just small camps, 2 or 3 hours once a month, to help them to see the way math is relevant in society, to help them to take a different view of science. And through this, they saw many junior youth for the first time really engaging with wide eyes, I can't believe this is math. I can't believe this is science. And then they were fostering a culture of really wanting to learn. And that's been, I think, just tremendous to see how many youth and these serious issues that they're tackling.
Mm-hmm. I think you can share further about even the fact that those youth, if it's the same neighborhood I'm thinking about, are not only doing these things, but they're also reflecting on the impact these things are having. I think what's also amazing to see is that you have young people who are reading the reality of their neighborhood, are looking at what action needs to be taken, are taking some approaches, are learning about it, are reflecting constantly about it. and then are trying things. So they've tried those workshops, but there's other things that you've shared before that they've done. They've seen something that they feel is challenging in their community, and then they consult as youth and take steps. So I don't know if you want to share.
Thanks for reminding me, Ayafor. Many of them have been talking about this process that we look at things from a long-term perspective, and we try to think about over time how change can happen. And one of the things that we have is this process of action, reflection, and consultation. So, for example, as you were saying, I think they're looking and trying to say, okay, how do we actually do this? So the first camp, for example, I don't think it was exactly what they were hoping for, but then they said, we're committed to this over time. And for over a few years of doing it, you begin to see that actually things are starting to change. And then they see that many young women actually in high school are choosing math and science as something that they are interested in. But I think this really important thing is that youth have a commitment to long-term change, and that we see them sometimes in society, things are just event-based. How is it that we can, over time, dedicate ourselves to a process and really our life be dedicated to the younger generation and to transforming our society?
Yeah, speaking of that reminded me of at one of the children's camp, we dedicated one camp for math. And how youth, they planned lessons together is so creative. Because always the girls feel that I'm not good at math. But we want to use this camp to teach them math is everywhere. It's not about multiplication, but it's about application. So the youth, they planned lessons for 5 to 7 years old to learn about the density, what flows and what sinks. So they did science experiment. So they they went to the water, got bucket of water, and they led the children to do a scavenger hunt. So they brought rocks and whatever. So they drop it in the water, see what sinks and what floated. And these floating things is just things that make you happy, like what brings you joy. So they are related to a spiritual concept to math. So for that one, this is heavy, so what brings me down? Such when I fight with somebody, that brings me down. So they're very creative, the youth.
I think we could also talk about these examples of youth, the vision that youth have in their neighborhoods that actually talk about the transformation of the entire community. And you can see how families and neighbors are responding to this. I think in many of our neighborhoods, we see, for example, simple projects that youth, along with their junior youth, they do maybe food drives, for example. And we heard today, one friend was sharing, but we also have heard this a few times when they run across a mother who says, actually, I was dependent on the food bank for a while. And so I'm very happy that you're engaging in this service of a food bank. And that leads to these people becoming actually very interested in how young people are spending their time in service. I think about a culture that is sometimes promoted of play among the young people. And sometimes they feel that they need to spend their time in entertainment and things like that. And actually, our communities are becoming amazed by seeing a different generation of young people who are giving their time to serving others.
One of the things the youth in Vancouver have been trying to learn about is there's all these forces of materialism around. And as they become conscious, it goes from we don't have a choice to somehow figuring out, actually, if we work together, maybe we do have a choice.
Right.
And the first part is just consciousness raising. So simple things like when they study, putting their phones away. And then they realize at the beginning it's really hard. It's almost like they're in withdrawal or something. But now over time, where there's certain habits have changed, actually even the younger ones are helping the new ones that come into a center, for example. Just put your phone at the door. Just trust me, it'll be good. And because then, and what they find is suddenly they're able to think now. They have these creative ideas come out, whereas so many of these things sap their energy. It's very enervating, actually. And the potential that they have as youth is blocked because of the very things that they're told in media and society. This is what a young person does. But then just one habit that's changed, suddenly all of these examples come out of helping younger generations, or this thing that the mothers see, oh, this person is giving freely of their time. Where did that time come from? It was all before sitting on social media or consuming things. But they put it away for a little while, and you see what comes is actually a desire to serve, to help their community.
Ms. Singh explains how reflection on the application of spiritual principles is enabling young people to make constructive choices in their lives.
In one place, the youth were really analyzing their community. And one of the challenges they saw in their schools was violence. And there was such difficult relationships amongst the students. There was constantly conflict and contention. So in one way, you could look and just say that's the way the world is. But I think these passages are helping them to see the world in a different way. So one of them would say, when a thought of war comes, oppose it by a stronger thought of peace. A thought of hate must be destroyed by a more powerful thought of love. And this quote helped them all to think that when something happens, we don't go to fights. We try to change our thoughts. And at the level of thought, we begin to change our action. So then they started thinking, how is it that more and more youth can be in touch with these kinds of concepts? Because surely it will help to change things. And not only is it one or two of us thinking of it, but for example, in our school, there are 1,200 students. Could all of them start thinking about something like this? And how could we do it? So this concern really prompted them to think about a sustained conversation in their community. So they were speaking together, they were talking with junior youth children and families, but they felt that they had to take this conversation to the high school. And I have to say, they encountered a lot of difficulties on the way. People didn't recognize the capacity of youth. They were suspicious. Why is it that you want to talk about this? What will you end up talking about? And so they really had to persevere and help the institutions and those around them to see their noble intentions. And once they were able to convince the principal and the teachers of their noble aspirations and intentions, they started having these unity and peace conferences in their neighborhood. And so they've been doing this now for a few years, and they've had this conversation go to hundreds of youths have been participating and thinking about ways that they can change their reality and how they can contribute to peace and become those promoters of peace in their community.
Yeah, just building on this idea of peace, as you know, the Ontario had a youth conference, and the theme of the youth conference was practitioners of peace. And this brought 700 youth from across the province. And there were a few really touching stories that were related to the conference. Many friends came up and they shared what's been happening in their neighborhood. But there was a group that came from Northern Ontario, a group of Indigenous youth, and it took them 2 days to get to the conference. And actually, they got a lot of support from their community to come. And it was really wonderful to see them. The conference, of course, was helping the young people to think about their role in being practitioners of peace and leading humanity in being practitioners of peace. And at the end of the conference, of course, a traditional dance was shared by this group. And at the end of the conference, they had such a moving presentation where each of them got up and shared what aspirations they had for their population.
Yeah, what you're sharing, it makes me think that there's concepts that young people have had from the past that just are inadequate for the future they're facing. So even the word peace historically has meant basically not fighting.
Right.
Even this Tim Goldman was saying about war, replacing with a stronger thought of peace. But it's actually replacing it. It's not just avoiding war. And then recognizing that the peace is not possible without unity. So we have to look at our history and all the suffering and the things we've done to each other, but not so that we say, well, let's not do those again. It's actually, in order to not do those again, we have to become united.
What was amazing also about that conference was you saw the beautiful tapestry that is humanity. That Canada is so diverse, and you saw every people, not all of them, but many cultures being celebrated and the diversity of humanity being celebrated. Sometimes we have a fear that we'll lose our culture, but in another way, we could see that all of these efforts were actually preserving the greatest parts of our culture and celebrating the diversity of the human family. And I feel this thing of the human body and all, when you think about one part of the world being affected, it affects all of us. And so many of these youth are finding that this is a more befitting response, because sometimes in our world, the chance you have is to be for or against something. It's a very polarized conversation, but they want to bring an analysis to it that helps everyone to see a place in working for something better. No matter what culture, what background, what religion we're from, that we are all needed to participate in this vibrant pattern of community.
I was just thinking, again, things might seem small to us, but then the impact it has. I know we were talking about this earlier in one neighborhood where, because of this vision that youth from many different backgrounds have, and they're working together, kind of like one of you was saying, that in this case, the city was looking at its next 50 years urban plan. And somehow they knew, this place you go, if you want the perspective of youth, this is the place you go. And so they came, two interesting things happened. One was, when they spoke to the youth had all kinds of ideas. They understood their neighborhood really well. The planners later on actually shared with some of the people that had organized that gathering that of all the little groups that they'd met with, this was the most impressive. And they could articulate, because what the youth were seeing is the problem with the plan was it was dividing people. It was actually reinforcing the things that keep people separate. And they were pointing out the thing, no, we want a neighborhood that brings people together, and the urban plan needs to reflect that.
I wonder if we can say something about, there's another stage where where youth go to university, and oftentimes this jump between high school and university, the youth feel like they have to spend all their time now studying and focusing on university, and we often they see in some neighborhoods they lose their enthusiasm for service in the neighborhood, or they become a little bit distant from it to prioritize university and work. But in some neighborhoods we're beginning to see, like I'm thinking about one neighborhood where almost all the activities are run by the young people. But what's actually very interesting is that, assisting the other youth to arise. But then you have some of the youth who are in very demanding university programs and are actually assisting their friends to actually come and assist in serving in the neighborhood. And what's interesting is that they're actually excelling at school.
As you enter into different stages of your life, so as you're, finishing high school, you're entering university or college or the workforce, other aspects of your life that are also meritorious start to make more demands on your time and your attention. So then these decisions that we make as young people can kind of dictate, okay, was service this thing that I did that summer or in my high school years that was so wonderful and I think about it fondly, or does it become this center in which everything comes into focus? I see everything through this lens. And I think one thing that we're seeing is that this culture of mutual support in being able to make decisions about our future that will then help service stay that fixed center around which everything revolves, or this kind of chapter in our lives. So you see this in different ways where, one youth with some of her peers did this workshop called Prep for the Future and had a series of workshops in terms of how do you prepare for the future. You have youth who will come together and they will sit and they will pick their university courses together. Like, how I'm now in university, can I pick help me pick my university courses in a way where I can continue to serve? Or I'm applying for university now. Like, what should I think? They were having these conversations with one another, and also with those that have maybe walked that path a little bit ahead of them and maybe are in their second or third year of university. But then also one thing that these young people have been thinking about is how do we contribute to processes of community life? And how does then also my profession contribute to that? Or what I'm going to study? I think these are some of the questions now that young people are grappling with, that it's not that I'm just balancing my time so I can make sure that I can continue to do my junior youth group, but then what are those like connections with my studies to my community.
Yeah, that reminds me of recently, was actually last year, and the children's class, the youth teachers were coming together with the children to consult on a service project. And then the conversation between the children and the youth teacher flow back and forth. Then somehow this new immigrant families of young, older grandparents visiting them, helping them, which is quite normal in Chinese culture. But in Western culture, it's not as prominent that they don't really involved with the younger generations, like helping in a way. But without older generation, our generation won't be here. So the idea came is like, okay, service projects, how can we honor the seniors? And oftentimes they sacrifice, but we don't see them. And then they decided to make a breakfast for the seniors. And then we have a facility, so that they bought materials, the pancakes, and you see those little young hands cutting those strawberries and bananas and serving the seniors. That made them so happy, because oftentimes the seniors are used to be giving, not receiving. So, and from that event, the youth teachers then started home visiting the children's class families, and then the youth teachers will tag team with a family, will go together, and this really formed really strong bonding among the teachers and the families were very hospitable, always fed the youth teachers with lots of good food, and the youth teachers love home visiting because they get lots of like food and love, and you see it's a sweet community. You see that emerging enrichment. Yes.
Recently, we were talking with one of the youth, and he has been preparing to do an active service where he helps other youth go through materials that help them to reflect on their true nature. So in one of the units of these materials, they reflect on the purpose of our lives. And they say that it's beyond the changes and chances of this world, that actually we're preparing, our souls are eternal, and we're preparing for both the spiritual and material dimensions of our lives. But he was thinking about a particular context of his friends in high school. And I said, certainly, you know that, I mean, these friends know, of course, they're thinking of that they have a soul and they're recognizing this. And he was saying, that's true. But there are so many distractions in our society around us that rob us of this memory of who we are and what our purpose is. And so he was saying that one of our challenges is to think day to day in the decisions that we're making about the purpose of our lives. And he found that through stimulating a conversation amongst peers and having this action and reflection on one's day, that one could remember the purpose of their lives and be reminded more and more of developing both their spiritual and their material qualities.
Yeah, I think this concept of purpose is one that we grapple with sometimes. Half the time we don't think about why we do things. And so young people, for example, are faced with this when a parent asks you, well, why are you doing this for free? And somebody just said the other day to me that when they're asked this by a parent, because the parent is curious why you're spending so much time, so concerned with the education of their child. And they said, well, because I believe that my life doesn't end here. I have a purpose. There's an afterlife, and then I build my capacities in this life to move ahead. And so, but in one way in which I do that is I serve others. And there's another simple thing that which many generations have known, that every generation of young people have always kind of led us forward. That's a simple thing about purpose, that being a youth, if I look in the history of humanity, youth have taken us forward. And sometimes that's just lost in all the distractions in society. So they see that even if you look back, I can see that I have a responsibility as a young person. Yes, it may be daunting, but I have a responsibility to build on the shoulders of the previous generation.
That reminds me of one of the conversation I recently had with the youth. Because every Sunday morning is children's class, and every Sunday we never cancel. They get up early in the morning for the youth, and for the junior youth, it's quite challenging. So one day after reflection space, I was just generally asking the question, why you're doing this? Why you're here? And the answer was really sweet to hear. And one of the youth said, it makes me happy when I see the transformation in children. When I see them serve in the class. After the children's class, they clean up and they put stuff away. That's a form of service that brings me joy.
I think also, when you look at the situation of the world, sometimes we can become hopeless. But youth are deliberately choosing to see hope and to align themselves with the forces of integration instead of the forces of disintegration. And I think when someone makes that conscious decision, you really get to feel like a protagonist, right? That you have a choice, that you get to form your destiny. And that is, I think, more and more the concept of empowerment, right? That we are protagonists on this path and that we also get to shape our destiny and that every single person is needed. And so it's not only one group doing it to another, but that it's all of society and we all have a place and all are needed.
You've been listening to In Conversation, a podcast series from the Baha'i World News Service. For more podcasts and stories, visit bwns.org.